Welcome back to the Student Hub Live, proud in 50 event from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the Open University. Now, you may or may not know that the Open University has had a long history of working with students in prison. And so in our 50th year, we're really keen to celebrate this history. So I'm joined by Head of Department, Steve, Zoe and Lawrence, all with various interests in this area. Lawrence, you've been working as a tutor with many students. Zoe, of course, as a central academic within the faculty, you've got a keen interest in this area. And of course, Steve, as head of department, you're overseeing a range of things, both in terms of criminology and also the students. So, Steve, I wonder if we could start with you and talk about what the role of the Open University is in prisoner education in the UK.
Well, the OU plays a unique role in educating students in prison, and of course, when it was established 50 years ago, the Open University was to be open to people who otherwise wouldn't have had access to higher education. So that's people who may be housebound, people with various kinds of ill health conditions, people in full-time work, and of course people in secure institutions such as prisons, such as secure hospital units. So from the very conception, from its very inception, part of the educational mission of the OU was to provide access to students in prison. So opens in 1969, and in 1971 the first students in prison study with the OU across 2 prisons, I think, in England. The following year an agreement was reached with the Home Office and it was opened up to 22 prisons. And now there are about, I think, 150 prisons across the UK and Ireland where students in prison are taught through Open University materials. It's virtually the same materials that are accessible to all of our students. And by far and away the biggest higher education provider in the sector for students in prison, and one of the I think the only, if not the only, one of the very few places, one of the very few universities which doesn't just open up education to students in prison, but actually allows them to study for and complete degrees. So we really have a unique and I think very important role in educating students in prison.
Yeah, and as the UK's largest distance education provider, of course it might seem theoretically very simple to be able to say, well, we package our materials, we create all of this so that at a distance, whilst you can have contact with a tutor, you can equally learn on your own. So it might be comparable to do that in a secure environment or in a prison or at your own home, but it's not always that simple, is it? I mean, there are a range of complexities that studying in prison entails that may make it not quite as easy.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that we hear from students in prison that have studied that way is how important it is to have that connection with an OU tutor who's often the person that kind of makes that experience work for them, because some of those barriers to study, that we all have barriers to study, but they have some that are kind of more unique and more difficult to overcome, that tutors are able to sort of help smooth the way for them to be able to continue their education.
Yeah. So how does it work then, Lawrence? You've had a lot of students over your years in prison. Do you go there?
Yes, I've tutored about 7 or 8 prisoners over the years in about 5 different prisons. And yeah, it's very fascinating. It's quite an intimidating place to go when you first go into a prison. It's also very interesting, if you've never been into a prison. I think at first I was a little bit voyeuristic even. But then once you settle down, I think it's just wonderful to meet the prisoners. I think it's a very special sort of place to tutor. I think the prisoners are, it's a great break for them from their usual environment, and they're not used to perhaps being treated with the sort of respect that they get treated with by their tutors. So, for example, they're not used to, I don't think, being asked their opinions and being listened to very carefully. So, yeah, most of it is face-to-face, and I think that was one of the things that was very rewarding about it.
So I think, irrespective of whether you're a student in prison or a student somewhere else, there's this thing about student identity that sometimes when you're with your books, you're primarily an OU student, even if the rest of the time you're a carer, a mother, these various other roles that you've got as a student. What you're saying, Lawrence, is really that when you're there with your students, there's this focus, there's something else other than your daily life, which happens in many other situations, where you and that student have a very, special relationship because you're focusing on their learning.
Yes, I mean, I think students in prisons are no different in many ways, that they're getting the same kind of thing from their degree, from their studies, sort of self-esteem, self-development, focusing on what they're interested in. But I think there's some things that are unique to that environment, which are that they're treated as a person, not as a number or their past action. They are yeah, like I say, you know, being listened to in a very respectful manner. And so, just, and also I think, sounds like I'm stating the obvious here, but if you're in prison, your life's not probably going in the direction that you perhaps wanted it to. And and I think one of the main reasons that I've always enjoyed tutoring is that you like to, it sounds a little bit pretentious in some ways, but you like to think you're making a difference. And I think it's very clear that you're making a difference. These people are trying to turn their lives round, and you're part of that. You feel that you're a very positive part of that.
And that's why they're studying, and that motivation is so important often, isn't it?
The motivation's crucial, and I think we should also, you know, just be very clear. So again, it's probably stating the obvious, but I think it's pretty important with my kind of criminology hat on to just remind ourselves that prisons can be pretty nasty places. I mean, they can be at best very boring environments where just the basic stimuli that make life worth living are denied to people who are inside. But they can also be violent. They're places of self-harm, they're places of violence, they're places of drugs. They can be places which are pretty uncomfortable in terms of infestations of vermin and so on and so forth. So they're not very pleasant environments for the most part, although of course they do vary. So to be able to offer something which takes the student out of that context, at least metaphorically, I think is really, really important, and can be. And while education is often important in the lives of people who return to studying, for example, who aren't traditional students, I think it's even more important for students, given the kind of environments within which most of them are housed.
And going on to that topic of motivation, Zoe, I mean, we were talking earlier about how some students will want to study psychology or the law because of their particular circumstances, but often that isn't quite what it seems, especially in psychology when they encounter lots of mathematics. So can you talk us through some of that sort of motivation and how that might play out? In particular, I guess when they're seen by a psychologist and perhaps want to understand psychology, so they're getting a grip on things, but perhaps then being part of that psychology group might not be the cool thing in that environment.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because obviously psychologists in prisons have quite a specific role, and very often, from the point of view of the prisoner, that's actually a psychologist that's making decisions about that affect whether or not that person's actually going to leave the prison environment. So as you can imagine, a lot of prisoners' views about psychologists aren't necessarily that positive. And sometimes it can be interesting for them to learn about the sort of psychometric tests that psychologists use, because these are the sort of things that are potentially being used on them, and that decisions are being made about. But what, of course, students quickly find, as all of our students find, is that psychology isn't all about psychometric testing. A lot of it's about statistics. It's about broad scientific method. And while some of it kind of relates to how do I work as a person and what's going on in my head, a lot of it is actually a lot broader than that. And so we tend to find that the things that really interest students once they get into the course are often quite different to the reasons they wanted to study it in the first place.
That happens for so many students as well.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's certainly in my own background, when I came back to study, I did an MSc in applied forensic psychology, which is kind of criminal psychology. And I really thought I wanted to work in a prison. That's why I wanted to do that course. But then when it came down to it and I started studying it, I got really interested in kind of the policing side rather than the offending side of criminal psychology. And that's the way I've gone. So I've kind of had that happen to me. And so, you know, I recognise it when it's happening to other students as well. That kind of, you go in for one reason, but what grabs you about the educational process is something completely different that you would never have predicted in the first place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't think you're alone at all. I mean, in criminology, you must see this all the time.
Yeah, very much so. I think people, students in general, wherever they come from, often come to criminology because they want to understand why people commit crime, and and how we can better prevent crime or solve crimes. They're interested in investigative work. And of course, those questions do form part of criminology, but certainly the criminology we do at the Open University is much, much more attuned to wider processes of how does the criminal justice system work, and how does it work disproportionately to kind of to drag into its ambit people who happen to be poor and marginalised, speak with a particular accent or have particular skin colour. So criminal justice works by ethnicity, by class. And it does that in the other way around, where criminal justice doesn't catch powerful criminals, it doesn't catch elite white-collar offenders or politicians who fiddle their expenses. Not that I imagine that happens anymore, apparently.
No.
So people very, very quickly see that there's all these other questions which are captured within in criminology, and that applies to students in prison just as much as it does our student population in general. And some books that have been written by students who study with the OU in prison make exactly that point. They see what they actually learn is not what makes people commit crime. They learn about how the system works to produce the label criminal being attached to some people as opposed to others. And of course, for some of them that's interesting. For some of them, it makes them quite angry actually at points.
Yeah. No, I bet. But for a lot of people, I mean, with a criminal record, there is a limitation in terms of certain areas you can practice. I know a lot of students will want to study law, for example, or psychology, but there are certain barriers as well that is associated with something, but yet they do it because of that interest.
Yeah, I think that must be very difficult, actually, for people who know that they're studying the same course as someone else, but know that the outcomes for them are just going to be very different because of their history. That must be quite challenging, actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
For one student that I got to know particularly well, I think for him, he was very much motivated by being assessed by psychologists and wanted to be able to converse with them, I think. And actually, I think he's done a lot for his self-esteem, that he will have conversations and sometimes arguments and sometimes be seen as a bit difficult because of the education that he's had. But I know that for him, he likes it. He takes a great deal of satisfaction out of the fact that he can sometimes say, oh, no, you're wrong there, or, you know, that's been discredited, that. I think he enjoys giving the assessors and the professionals in his life a little bit of a shock because
So
he's
this idea
educated.
of knowledge as power.
Yes. I think,
And did it work for this particular student?
well, I think it worked for him in terms of his self-esteem. I don't think it's worked for him in terms of getting him released. I think sometimes actually he's seen as a little bit of a problem because of his education. But I know that for him, he doesn't care. He likes the fact that... it reminds me actually of sometimes when I've been in hospital occasionally with a little... having a bit of medical knowledge, sometimes the doctor can be a bit surprised if you suddenly show that you've got a bit of medical knowledge. They think, oh, the patient speaks. And I think he's enjoyed those few moments a little bit. So for his self-esteem, it's been great.
Yeah. Now, you get so much out of studying, but, you know, we mentioned some of the challenges that are there, and I think time management's one of those challenges that, well, we've talked about so many different times, but particularly in a secure environment, there are all these other things, access to a computer room, you know, trying to be organised enough to maybe complete your ICMAs on paper, or, you know, internet access is limited, and there are various sorts of ways in which students in those environments are going to have to be very, very clever about how they use their time to get stuff done.
Yeah.
Very much so. There was a graduate in law from the Open University who was speaking on a radio broadcast a few weeks ago, and she was talking about. I mean, she ended up getting a first-class honours, by the way, a couple of years ago, C.J. Burge. But she was talking about the problem of noise. She said she had to study at night when it's often very difficult to see, just because during the day, even when she had free time, the prison that she was in was just too noisy to be able to study, and that's something which, if you haven't been in that environment, I suspect you wouldn't even ever think about.
I was talking to somebody just on the train coming down here today, and telling her this. I was going to talk about everything that we're talking about here, and she was saying, oh yeah, I've heard. She was giving the usual line of, I've heard in prisons it's very easy. You know, apparently they've all got televisions and PlayStations and everything. And so I was just saying that actually, for me, somebody getting a degree in prison is really hard. I mean, they work, they have a work regime, and they have to try and get into the education department when they can. They have problems sometimes just with the post, you know, like just posting something, it doesn't seem to get there on time. They have to share cells with people that are very often not supportive of their studies and are very noisy. It's a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Let's take a quick trip to HJ and Damon and see how everyone is back at home, HJ.
I know Kelvin's really interested in this session as it's relating to what he wants to. He wants to go into forensic psychology. So our session about Stonewall earlier really linked into what he's interested in, and this session with students in secure environments. And I know Damon has tutored some students as well in secure environments.
Yeah, again, similar experience with Lawrence. The dedication of the students is just phenomenal. And how they manage to do it, I've no idea. I've always been amazed at how they do. But yeah, there's a lot of positive feedback on this through the interaction on here.
Yeah. And you mentioned students graduating, and indeed you've been to a graduation ceremony, and how wonderful that was, with so many people involved with that one person's success.
Yes, apparently it was the first graduation ceremony in HMP Manchester, sometimes known as Strangeways to people in Manchester, but it's HMP Manchester. It was apparently the first ever graduation ceremony in prison. And Matthew did his whole degree in prison, and independently, interestingly, there are 3 Open University tutors who we don't know, well, we kind of know each other now through Matthew, but we'd all independently formed a sort of, we kept in touch, and so we were all involved or represented in some way. I went there with my wife. There was at least 10 or 15 prison officers who'd seen Matthew go through this process. He had been, on his records, I've seen that it said educationally subnormal, which I'm sure is a phrase that isn't used by anybody anymore, but that was on his records. And he'd graduated with a degree, and I have to say it was really moving. There was prisoners there, the governor of the prison came, and it was moving. Matthew couldn't speak. He kept saying, I've got a bit of a dry throat, I don't know what's wrong with me. But
He kept saying, let me write a TMA for you.
And yeah, he was in a very ill-fitting suit that somebody had lent to him for the occasion. And it was a wonderfully amazing experience, yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about some of the various things. Just looking to the future now, because we've been reflecting on some of the past. How do you see the sort of OU's role, Steve, in terms of the importance of this in the future? Do you think that it's a continuing area? What do you sort of see in terms of areas that people may be interested in the future, either studying or with the Open University?
Well, the students in prison study across the range of curricula that we offer here, although there are a disproportionate number, I think, that study in FASS, in Arts and Social Science. But the OU faces particular challenges. Certainly the kind of move to teach and learn online is a challenge for the reasons that you gave. I mean, often students struggle to get access to a laptop, for example, but they can't have free access to the internet. They can't have free access to our library resources. So the kind of the increasingly online and digital world is a challenge for the Open University. We've got a great group of people here who work in the Students and Secure Environments Unit, headed by Ruth McFarlane, really dedicated to both improving the kind of experience of students in prison, but also dedicated to improving access to our courses, so trying to build up the numbers of students in prison who are studying with us. So, and Ruth and her colleagues have taken that number up in recent years from, I think, about 1,100 to about 1,800 students now studying with us, so they're really on a kind of upwards trajectory. So, and I think it's really important that we as an institution, that we should look back and celebrate 50 years in this area and many other areas, but that we increasingly try to deliver on our mission, which is social justice, and these are some of the most troubled people in our society, and we should be offering the facilities to them.
And like the way that the OU has always been very innovative, Ruth and her team, they're developing a virtual campus, and increasingly looking at problems and how to find those solutions, but equally the digital aspect is one part of it. It's the social thing. It's about getting people in those environments to ask for access to these things and to work with those education advisors so that they're able to fulfil the needs of those students in those places.
Absolutely, and let's not forget that a really good protective factor against someone reoffending is education. Either being released into education or released into work is massively important, and so that there's a real genuine kind of purpose to all of this outside, if you like, of just the individual's own achievement and all the rest of it. We know it's a protective factor, and so it's even at a societal level, if you look at it like that, it's doing good from that point of view as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. It's been a really, really useful session. So Steve, Zoe and Lawrence, thank you so much. We're going to have a video now, which is more of Zoe, which is about the Centre for Policing Research and Learning. And then we'll be back in this next session to look at FASS Rewind and FASS Forward with Naomi, Graham and George. We'll see you in a few minutes.